Audio lecture of Unit 8 for Contemporary West, The Height of New Imperialism. The New Imperialism, intro first. First of all, it's important for us to know what we mean by the new imperialism. We are contrasting it to the old imperialism that happened with the Age of Exploration back in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. So this is a new wave of imperialism, meaning a new wave of empire building by the nations of Europe. They are grabbing territories, mostly in Africa and Asia, but as we will see, there are other nations grabbing in other areas. But they're grabbing territories, and they are motivated by the need for raw materials for their industries because the Industrial Revolution has happened. But they're also motivated by the fact that land equals power on the world stage. And there are no more lands really to expand into within Europe. So they start looking elsewhere. So now we know this new wave of imperialism we're talking about mostly starting in the second half of the 19th century and carrying over into the early 20th century. Through the new imperialism, Westerners sought to control vast territories. Colonial export policies exploited the native populations of the areas that they took over, and it opened up new markets also for European manufactured goods due to the Industrial Revolution. So here are some questions we have to grapple with as we go through this unit. First of all, why were Westerners so determined to colonize Southeast Asia and Africa? Then, what was the chief goal of the Western nations? The colonial export policies, as we said, exploited native populations, but also opened up new markets for European manufactured goods. In the 1800s, European nations began a new push of imperialism, or empire building, which really means the extension of a nation's power over other lands. A new phase of Western expansion into and trade with Asia and Africa began in the 19th century, largely motivated because of the need for new raw materials that they could then manufacture into manufactured goods with the industries back in the home country. Asia and Africa were seen as a source of these raw materials for industrial production, but they also were seen as a new market opening up for Europe's manufactured goods. So in other words, the idea was to move into these territories, colonize them, take the raw materials from these lands, take those raw materials back to the home country, manufacture them into manufactured goods, and then sell them to other industrial nations, but also even back to the colonies where they got the raw materials from. We'll discuss how successful or unsuccessful both of those things were as we go through this. Yes, they were able to get raw materials from most of these places, but most of these places did not really become new markets for European goods because they had no need for those European goods because they had not advanced into the industrial era. This new imperialism was not content to have trading posts and agreements as the old imperialism was, like meaning from the Age of Exploration in the 1500s. But instead, this new imperialism wanted direct control over territories, from the mother country having direct control over the territories. That would mean to conquer those people and to force them to become part of a greater colonial empire. There was a strong economic motive for the Western nations also to increase their search for colonies after 1880. Europeans wanted direct control of the raw materials that they needed for their industries back at home. And they also want markets that they thought that they could find in places like Asia, Africa, and even Latin America. European nations also acquired colonies to gain an advantage over their European rivals, looking for colonies and world power. This is where that land equals power idea comes from. The more land your nation controls, the more influence and power you are seen to have on the world stage. And this will cause a lot of competition for these spheres of influence around the world, as well as friction and fighting over these territories. This new wave of imperialism is just one step away from fighting each other outright in World War I. So new imperialism is oftentimes seen as a long fuse leading up to World War I. And as you can see, having colonies was also seen as a source of national prestige. Land equals power. So let's talk a little bit more about these motives in more depth here. The new imperialism was tied indeed to racism, as well as the concept of social Darwinism that we have discussed in a previous unit. Now remember, social Darwinism came about from Herbert Spencer, who was a social scientist. He took a lot of Darwin's ideas about nature and took them out of context, so to speak, and applied them to society. Remember, social Darwinism basically means those nations that have harnessed the power of science and who have been able to develop technology had the right to take over other nations that did not, because they were more fit to rule territories that did not have the technology. In other words, the idea of might is right, which of course is racist also, since the nations that were taking over the other territories were predominantly Western, and the nations that were being taken over were predominantly in Africa and in Asia, and they were people of different races from those Europeans that were taking over the territories. So, to social Darwinists, the imperialist European nations were simply exerting themselves in the struggle for the fittest to survive in this world. European nations saw losing territories as these losing nations as racially inferior to them. So therefore, they had the right to take over these territories. So that's what I mean when I say social Darwinism is also racist at its heart. Others believe that Western nations had the moral or religious duty to civilize these territories, the Africans, the Asians, the Latin American nations, which often meant to Christianize them, which is not really freedom of religion, but more do what we say is right because we are right and you are wrong. So it also smacks of a kind of paternalism, if you will. Kipling's White Man's Burden poem we will be discussing with an activity that we're going to be doing with this unit, and you're going to see what I mean by this idea that is their duty to civilize these areas. In reality, that was a justification and an excuse for what they were doing, because in reality, they were not really lifting these people up to their standards. Instead, they were using that as an excuse to exploit them. So now let's talk about imperialism in Southeast Asia. The colonial takeover in Southeast Asia, we see by 1900, almost all of Southeast Asia was under Western rule. And you can look at this map and see all the different territories that were taken over by the different European nations. The British had the pink, the Dutch had the yellow, the French had the lavender, the Portuguese had the light aqua, Spanish had the green, and then there were a few independent states like Siam in there. Great Britain actually led the way in the late 19th century, the late 1800s, in this imperial colonialism. It actually began even earlier in the 19th century. In 1819, Great Britain founded a colony on the small island called Singapore, which means City of the Lion. In the new age of steamships, Singapore soon became a major port for traffic to and from China. And this would benefit British trade and exporting British goods throughout Asia. The British will move deeper into Southeast Asia in the next decades. Britain will eventually take control over Burma, which is present-day Myanmar, to protect its possessions in India that it had claimed back in the 17th century. And also to have a land route to get to South China, where they also had trade interests. France also had interest in this region, in particular in Vietnam, and they were alarmed by the British expansion into Southeast Asia. This sort of kick-started the French expansion into the region as well, trying to keep up with Great Britain. To stop any British move on Vietnam, the French government decided in 1857 to force the Vietnamese to accept French protection. Now, that word protection is something that we need to discuss here, because as we see in 1884, the French seized control over Hanoi, the city of Hanoi, and later made the Vietnamese Empire into a French protectorate. The word protectorate means a political unit that depends on another government for its protection. In reality, protection just meant dominance. In order to really understand this, we need to understand, like I said before, the concept of social Darwinism. The French believed that because they had the technology to take over Vietnam, they had the military might, they had the new weapons due to the Industrial Revolution to dominate the area, that they had the right to. And they thought that they were protecting their own trade interests abroad in this region as well. Protectorate, they weren't really protecting the Vietnamese people. They were protecting the French interests in the area. Although they will call it a protectorate, it really means domination. In the late 1880s, France extended its control over other territories in the region as well: Cambodia, Laos, Annam, and Tonkin. This whole area eventually will be known as French Indochina, the French Empire in Indochina. In the final quarter of the 19th century, both Britain and France tried to take Thailand, tried to make Thailand a colony. And ultimately, this fight is kind of interesting because there were actually two remarkable rulers in Thailand that prevented the takeover of that area from either nation. We have King Mongkut, who was memorialized in the Broadway musical The King and I, and his son, King Chulalongkorn. Both of these guys promoted friendly relations with the West instead of antagonism, and they also courted Western learning in Thailand, hoping that if they did so, those bigger nations would be less likely to try to dominate them, instead maybe seeing them as a partner. In 1896, France and Britain actually both agreed to maintain Thailand as an independent buffer state between their possessions in the region of Southeast Asia. So by adopting Western principles, they actually won the respect, I guess you would say, of these Western nations. But many would argue Thailand lost a lot of its own cultural practices in exchange for becoming Westernized. But they did maintain their independence thanks to those two kings. The United States also contributed to this imperialism fever, if you will, the scramble for territories in the late 19th century. Naval forces under Commodore George Dewey defeated the Spanish in Manila Bay and in the Philippines area. This was part of the Spanish-America War. When we did this, President William McKinley believed it was his and our moral duty to civilize other parts of the world. This is part of that white man's burden idea again, that we are delivering civilization to these people, when in reality, we are using that as an excuse to dominate these regions to benefit our nation. Colonizing the Philippines, the U.S. colonizing the Philippines, would also, we thought, prevent it from coming under Japanese rule and would serve the United States' interests in securing a jumping off point for trade with China. And so this was a region that we wanted to maintain a naval base in, and ultimately we would protect our trade interests in all of Asia by doing so. Many Filipinos actually objected to the colonization of the U.S. in the Philippines. They had also earlier, centuries before, objected to the Spanish colonization of the region. So it's no surprise that they didn't want now, hundreds of years later, the U.S. to take over the region. One of those that objected was Emilio Aguinaldo. He was the leader of an independence movement, a Filipino nationalist movement, if you will. And his guerrilla forces fought against the Spanish and the United States. But the United States eventually will defeat those guerrilla tactics and will be able to take over the entire region. Now, folks, remember, guerrilla tactics, spelled with a G-U-E-R-R-I-L-L-A, that means a kind of warfare, a kind of fighting with sneak attacks. And when you don't have large amounts of forces and you don't have the weaponry to fight an all-out battle, face-to-face battle with your opponent, you have to use these kinds of sneak attacks in order to try to gain an advantage. So that's what we mean by guerrilla warfare. Now, why did imperialism change eventually from having trade relations with territories to governing and administering the territories, meaning direct control over the territories? So most of the colonial territories that were taken over in the first wave of imperialism, or old imperialism, in the age of exploration, were more having trade relations with those territories. There were some, of course, that were dominating the areas, of course, the Spanish and the British, but we see more of that whole idea of dominating and governing and administering the territories in the late 19th century with this new wave of imperialism. First and foremost, European nations needed to guarantee control over areas so other European nations would not move in on their territories and take the raw materials that they needed for their industry. Governing these areas gave a tighter economic hold on the areas under European control. The chief goal of Western powers in their colonies ultimately was to exploit the natural resources there, as well as to try to open up new markets for Western manufactured goods. The colonial powers ruled either indirectly or directly. Now, these are two different styles of governing in the new imperialism time period. Okay, indirect rule means that the local rulers were allowed to maintain some of their own authority as long as they cooperated with the goals of the Western parent country. Okay, this was actually a preferred way of doing imperialism in the 19th century because it was less costly. The mother country, if you will, the country that was conquering, would not have to send as much manpower to maintain control over the colony if they could convince the elites, the local elites, to join with them in the effort and to instead of fighting against them, help them govern over the area. When the local elites resisted the foreign conquest, though, indirect rule was not practical, and then they had to opt for direct rule. Direct rule was when the new officials from the mother country or the conquering country were put in charge of everything, including taxes, law and order, and other government matters. This ultimately was Britain's approach in Burma, for example, where the British abolished the monarchy there and took over. France used direct rule and indirect rule in parts of their empire in Indochina. They had a protectorate in Vietnam, and again, that protectorate means that they were dominating the area, and they sent in French officials to govern there. So a protectorate normally was an indirect form of rule. They will use the local population so they don't have to send as many of their own officials to go and govern the area. But there will be some protectorates that will be more direct rule. We will see when we talk about India that the British, who had dominated that region since the 1600s, originally governed India through indirect rule, convincing the local officials to work with them to govern the area. But eventually it will shift to direct rule after a rebellion happens. So we'll discuss both as we go through the rest of these slides. All right, colonial takeover in Southeast Asia, again, justifications. Let's talk more about those. Western powers often justify their conquests by arguing that they, quote, brought civilization and development to these people. These same powers, however, often feared the indigenous peoples gaining political rights, and they worried that they would lose their dominance over the region if they allowed them to have too many rights. The concern was that the native peoples might want full participation in the government or even independence. So colonial powers did not want their colonists to develop their own industries. They wanted them to be dependent upon the mother country for manufactured goods. So in other words, the mother countries wanted to go into these regions. They wanted to take the raw materials. They wanted to take those raw materials back to the mother country to be manufactured into manufactured goods that would then be sold back to those living in the colonies, rather than building factories in the colonies. You see what I'm saying? Okay. Colonial powers, like I said, did not want their colonists or their colonies to develop their own industries. They wanted them to be dependent on the parent country. Thus, the parent country stressed exporting those raw materials like teak wood, rubber, tin, spices, tea, coffee, sugar, and others. They would export those back to the mother country, and then they'd be manufactured into products that could then be sold back to the colonies. In many places, the native people worked as wage laborers on plantations that were now owned by foreign investors. Plantation owners kept wages at a poverty level, and conditions on plantations were often very, very difficult, horrible even. Colonial governments often levied high taxes on the peasants, the native populations as well. Colonial rule did bring some benefits to Southeast Asia eventually. It did begin a modern economic system that improved infrastructure in the area, building roads and bridges and digging canals. But these were things that those native populations may not have needed had they not been taken over, or that they could have developed on their own when they did need them. But it also did expand exports and developed an entrepreneurial class in some of the rural areas that were taken over, even though most of the export profits went to the mother country ultimately. Now, resistance to colonial rule did happen, obviously. Initial resistance when the mother countries were trying to take over would come from those ruling classes in the area, the native population's ruling class among those subject peoples. Sometimes resistance to Western rule took the form of peasant revolts as well. Peasants often were driven off their lands to make way for plantation agriculture, and they did not like losing their small farms to these now large European plantation owners. Early resistance movements were overcome by Western powers, largely because the Western powers had weapons that the native populations could not compete with, especially the breech-loading Gatling gun. We'll talk more about these new kinds of weapons due to industrial technology as we move forward. At the beginning of the 20th century, a new kind of resistance based on the force of nationalism emerged in many of these conquered territories. The leaders often were a new class that were actually created by colonial rule, these westernized intellectuals in some of these cities. So in other words, in particular in places that utilized indirect rule, the mother countries would oftentimes educate the local elites, the local rulers, in the Western system, so they could then govern in a Western style for the mother country. Ultimately, however, these Western intellectuals that were of the native population oftentimes would be the ones that would eventually sponsor nationalist sentiment among the local populations. These new leaders were part of a new urban middle class. Some of them were merchants, clerks, students, and professionals, which had been educated in those Western schools, spoke Western languages, and knew Western customs. At first, the resistance movements organized to protect religious traditions in many of these areas, as well as the native economic interests. In the 1930s, these resistance movements began to demand national independence, meaning they wanted to throw off the leadership of the mother country. This will happen more so, as you will see, in the interwar years between World War I and World War II, and even more so after World War II is over. Now let's talk a little bit about imperialism in Africa. Great Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, and Portugal all placed virtually all of Africa under European rule by the early 20th century. All right, Europeans did not hesitate to deceive the African populations in order to get their land and natural resources. Okay, as slavery was abolished, Europe's interest in other forms of trade increased. For example, trading manufactured goods for peanuts, timber, hides, and palm oil, all which were natural resources that those Western nations could use in their industries. In the early 19th century, the British, for example, established settlements all along the Gold Coast and in Sierra Leone in Africa. The growing European presence in Western Africa caused increasing tensions with local African governments who feared for their own independence. In 1874, Great Britain annexed the west coastal states in Africa as the first British colony that they called the Gold Coast. Simultaneously, it established a protectorate over the warring Nigerian groups in the area of Nigeria. So they basically were taking over these large chunks of Africa, and the native populations could not compete with the European weapons. France also will start to take over areas. They will control the largest part of West Africa, and Germany will come in and control Togo, Cameroon, and what is called German Southwest Africa and German East Africa. Let's talk about imperialism in North Africa first. Egypt had been part of the Ottoman Empire for years, but in 1805, an officer in the Ottoman army named Muhammad Ali, no, not the boxer, seized power and established a separate Egyptian state. He actually, I guess you would say, rebelled against being part of the Ottoman Empire that he actually served and became the ruler of an independent national state in Egypt. Now, as this new state, Ali introduced a series of reforms to try to modernize Egypt along the European model. He modernized the army, which he now established his own personal Egyptian army. He set up a public school system like they had now developed in Western Europe, and he helped create small industries that they could export goods to other areas. The growing economic importance of the Nile Valley, that of course was controlled by Egypt, along with the development of steamships, gave Europeans a desire to build a canal east of Cairo to connect the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. Great Britain and France in particular wanted to dig what this is called the Suez Canal, okay, because this could get them to their interests in India and Southeast Asia without having to sail all the way around the Cape of Good Hope at the tip of Africa, cutting out a lot of sailing time. It all begins in 1854 when Ferdinand de de Lesseps, a Frenchman, signed a contract to build the Suez Canal. It will be completed finally in 1869. Now, Great Britain bought Egypt's share from the descendants of Muhammad Ali in the Suez Canal. So for a while, it was actually owned jointly by Great Britain and France, who were not great friends, but as we know, eventually will become allies because they both worry about the growth of German aggression more than each other. We discussed that in the last unit. Ultimately, Great Britain suppressed an 1881 revolt against foreign influence in Egypt, and all of Egypt ultimately becomes a British protectorate in 1914. So Egypt will cease to exist as an independent state by 1914, and it will become a British colony. When the British take over Egypt, they now will control all of the Suez Canal by controlling Egypt. The British believe that they should control also the Sudan and the south of Egypt, the southern part below Egypt. In 1881, the Muslim cleric Muhammad Ahmad seized control of the Sudan and defeated, actually, the British military force under General Charles Gordon in 1885. The British Army was actually wiped out at the Battle of Khartoum, but Gordon died in the battle. But even though the Sudanese had this early victory, it awoke a sleeping giant, if you will, and so the British will send more forces down to the Sudan. They had thought that they could take over the area with a small force, but realizing that the people of Sudan were going to fight so harshly, they will send more forces there and they will completely obliterate them. The British will ultimately be able to seize control of all of the Sudan by 1898, and thousands upon thousands of Sudanese die in the process. The French had colonies also in North Africa. In 1879, about 150,000 French had settled the region of Algeria. The French government established control there, along with making protectorates of both Tunisia and Morocco. Italy also joined the competition for North African colonies by trying to take over Ethiopia. Unfortunately for Italy, but fortunately for the Ethiopians, the Ethiopian forces actually defeated the Italians in 1896, thwarting the Italian desire for taking Ethiopia as a colony. Italy was actually humiliated by this defeat. They were, a Western power, and they were defeated by a local population that was less militarily developed, and it was a huge humiliation for Italy. They will try again to conquer Ethiopia in 1911, and they will eventually be able to take it after World War II is over. World War I is over. Italy will also, however, even though they weren't able to take Ethiopia right away, they will take some other territories. They will take what was originally known as Turkish Tripoli, and they will rename it Libya. European explorers had generated European interest in the dense tropical jungles of Central Africa, where they discovered were lots of raw materials that they could use for the industry, in particular rubber plants that could be, of course, manufactured into a number of different things. Now, how will they conquer this area? Because they really didn't know much about the interior of Africa at all. It had never been colonized before. Even back in the original age of exploration, this is a territory that was never really penetrated. They just sort of hung around the coastlines, the European powers, when they took areas. So the British will actually send a missionary into the heart of Africa. His name was David Livingstone. He arrived in Africa in 1841, and he will trek through the unexplored interior of Africa for 30 years. He actually would send back, I guess you would say, journal entries and those kinds of things that he found as he was traveling through the interior of Africa, and they would oftentimes be printed in the newspapers throughout England. And this, of course, will continue to pique interest for maybe coming in and taking over these areas. But eventually he disappeared for a while. His letters stopped coming and nobody knew where he was. People feared that he had died in the jungle. When he disappeared for a while, the New York Herald, even in the United States, the people were interested in what he was saying about the interior of Africa because it would be published in more than just the English newspapers. So the New York Herald actually sent a young journalist named Henry Stanley to try to find Dr. Livingstone. And he would send back his reports of what he found as he was pushing into the interior of Africa. He will finally find Dr. Livingstone alive and well, and he, of course, the famous line, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume," is what he says. Although he said he disliked the place, Henry Stanley did stay in Africa, and in the 1870s, he sailed down the Congo River and explored that region. He actually eventually encouraged the British to send settlers to the Congo River basin. When the British refused, Stanley turned to another European territory, Belgium. King Leopold II of Belgium was very interested in this region. Yes, it would be a difficult area to take over because the jungle is not a very inviting place. It's going to take a lot to conquer an area in the jungle. But King Leopold II of Belgium ultimately was the real driving force behind the colonization of Central Africa. He recognized that there was rubber plants there, as I said before, that could be very lucrative for European industries. In 1876, he actually hired Henry Stanley, who was no longer employed by the New York Herald. He took Henry Stanley up on his offer and he said, "Please set up a Belgian settlement in the Congo area in my name." Belgium's claim to the vast territories of the Congo region started to worry other European states, however, once they found out that this area was rich in resources. France rushed there to grab a territory after Belgium had claimed it. Belgium ended up with the territories around the Congo River, and France will occupy the territories farther north. As you can see, it's like when one territory finds something of value there, it causes a scramble for territory by the other nations. And this competition for territories, the scramble for territories, and ultimately competition between nations over these territories causes a kind of tug of war, as you see in the picture down below, over these territories. The tug of wars and the competition between the different European nations over who's going to get what territories in these areas will eventually be that long fuse leading up to World War I. Them fighting each other over these spheres of influence is just one step away from those nations in Europe fighting each other outright in an all-out war. By 1885, Britain and Germany had become the chief rivals in East Africa. At first, Bismarck, who was still in employment in Germany, he will not be fired by Kaiser William II until 1890. Okay, so this is still when William I is the Kaiser. At first, Bismarck had downplayed the importance of colonies in Germany because he was more concerned with building up what was going on domestically in Germany, building up all of the domestic power that he and the king would have, even though it incorporated, a social security system and those kinds of things. But eventually he became a convert to colonialism after Germans called for a German empire, a real German empire in other parts of the world. This was a little late to the game, though. In the 1880s, Great Britain and France had already claimed huge amounts of territory in Asia and had claimed territories in Africa. So because Germany had had not formed a really united nation until 1871, they were really latecomers to this imperial land grab. and they were now seen as having only the scraps left to take. Bismarck, being the brilliant politician that he was, tried to negotiate a way to get Germany some prime real estate in Africa by calling the Berlin Conference of 1884-85. This was where he invited all of the major European powers to come, and they would basically take a map of Africa and they would determine who would get what territory, dividing it up, giving recognition to the German desire to take territories in East Africa, as well as the British territories that already existed there, and the Portuguese claims of territories along the coastline that they had had for years. What's interesting is that this Berlin Conference only invited Western leaders, European leaders, to the conference to determine the fate of Africa. No African local delegates, no African rulers. There were kings and things in Africa. None of them were invited to the conference. This shows you that the Western imperialist nations did not see those local rulers as having a valid claim to those territories, even though they were theirs. This smacks of racism. The fact that the European nations felt that they had the right to take these territories because they had the might, and they also saw themselves as superior, ethnically and racially superior to the local populations. This just smacks of racism. It shows you part of the problems with this time period. Now, in South Africa, what happened there is also a dicey thing. By 1865, close to 200,000 Europeans had moved to the southern part of Africa as colonists. Now, there were already people that were of European descent living in South Africa. They were called the Boers, also known as the Afrikaners. They were actually descendants of the original Dutch settlers who had occupied Cape Town in South Africa back in the 1600s or the 17th century. So they had been there already for, 200 years. Later, the British move into these territories and they want to take these lands from those Boers, those Afrikaners, those descendants of the original Dutch settlers in that region. In the 1830s, the Boers fled British rule in some of those areas, going northward and establishing an independent Republic of Transvaal, later the South African Republic, and the Orange Free State, as they would be called. The Boers, however, believed that white supremacy, because they were white, even they were Dutch, they were the descendants of the original Dutch settlers. So they were not the native population, even though they had lived there for a couple hundred years. They believed that white supremacy was ordained by God and put many native peoples on reservations as they claimed these territories. They fought the Zulu people, for example, who rose to prominence under their great leader, Shaka Zulu. Later, the British will fight against the same Zulu as they come in to try to dominate this area. So the British will not only have to fight against the Zulu, they will also have to fight against the Boers. In the 1880s, the British policy in South Africa as they take over was influenced by a British imperialist but also British businessman named Cecil Rhodes. He had actually set up a diamond and gold company that made him fabulously wealthy, and he had moved in and taken over some of these regions himself. He named the territory north of the Transvaal after the Boers would be defeated as Rhodesia after himself. And if you look at this picture that I have here, it's actually the face of Cecil Rhodes showing you all the hands trying to take over these territories, even though it says England as a label underneath them, so representing England taking all these territories, but with the face of Cecil Rhodes, meaning English businessmen are determining English foreign policy in these territories. Rhodes' ambitions led eventually to his downfall in 1896, when the British government forced him to resign as Prime Minister of Cape Colony after finding out he planned to overthrow the Boer government of the South African Republic without British approval. Not that the British didn't want to overthrow the Boer government. They will, and they will overthrow the Boer government. But they did not want Rhodes to think that he had a personal claim to that territory instead of Great Britain, the country. So eventually, after throwing out Rhodes, the British sent their armies in. They will fight a war against the Boers, the Boer War, to try to take the territory of South Africa. And they will eventually succeed. The Boer War was fought ultimately from 1899 to 1902. There was fierce guerrilla resistance by the Boers that angered the British. The British would continually be surprised by these guerrilla attacks, and they would retaliate. The British would retaliate to these attacks by burning crops and herding about 120,000 Boer women and children into detention camps, causing some 20,000 of them to die of starvation and exposure. This will anger the Boers, of course, and they will continue the guerrilla attacks, but eventually the British army will be sent down there and they will completely obliterate the Boers. By 1910, the British created the Independent Union of South Africa, combining the Cape Colony and the Boer republics, and they will now be controlled by the British. This will, however, be a self-governing nation within the British Empire. They will be governed by British folks, but those British folks had independence to govern the area. They will have, the British government will actually have a lot of influence over them, even though it was not direct rule by the British government. It was more indirect rule. To appease the Boers that were still living there after they had been conquered, the policy was that only whites and a few propertied Africans could vote in this region of the Union of South Africa, so that white supremacy domination of the region that had been started by the Boers will be continued by the British in South Africa. This will eventually become known as apartheid. The apartheid movement of white supremacy in South Africa will not end until the 1990s, when finally Nelson Mandela will be successful in ending apartheid in that area. By 1914, only two small territories, Liberia, which had been created by freed U.S. slaves, and Ethiopia, these were the only two areas that were free from European domination. Remember, Ethiopia had successfully thwarted the Italians taking over Ethiopia twice, actually. Once in the late 1800s, once in 1911. Now, Ethiopia will eventually be taken over by Italy, but not until after World War I is over. We'll discuss that later. It's when Mussolini takes control over Italy. So these are the only two territories that are left independent by 1914, the dawn of World War I. You can look at this map I have here, and it shows you this. All those flags represent the European nations that had taken over the various places. Native armed forces had been devastated by the superior European forces, the superior weapons of the European forces. Britain especially relied on existing political elites and institutions to govern its colonies, more indirect rule than direct rule, as much as they could because it was cheaper, as I said before. An advantage of indirect rule for the indigenous peoples is that it interfered much less with their traditions and customs, even though they were not really independent. However, most decisions came from the parent country, and local rulers rubber-stamped and enforced these decisions, maintaining their own power at the expense of the rest of the native population below them. This system sowed the seeds of later class and tribal tensions among native peoples. And after World War II, these tensions, as these areas gain their independence, will continue to plague the region. And this is another reason why a lot of territories in Africa are still kind of unstable today. These tribal tensions will not be able to be reconciled effectively. And we still have issues in some of these regions today. Most other European governments in Africa, besides the British, used instead direct rule in Africa, where they would send in their own people to govern rather than trying to train the local population in the, French style or the German style or what have you, like the British train, westernize their local populations with British education, etc. The French appointed a governor general in their colonies in Africa, and they set up their own colonial bureaucracy. The French ideal was to try to assimilate the African peoples into French culture. They did not want to preserve the African traditions. In fact, they insisted that all of their colonies adopt speaking the language of French, adopt Roman Catholicism, and abandon their own traditional customs. This will not go over well with some people, but this explains a lot as to why some of those areas in Northern Africa in particular still speak French today. A new class of African leaders emerged in the early 20th century. As I said before, this had a lot to do with the indirect rule of some of the mother countries like Great Britain, trying to indoctrinate, if you will, the local populations so they could use them to help them govern the territory. These were mostly intellectuals. They knew about the West from their education in colonial and Western schools. And the members of this new class often admired Western culture and wanted to introduce Western ideas and institutions into their own culture because they saw certain aspects of European culture as superior to their own cultures. In other words, they drank the Kool-Aid, folks. They had been educated to believe that the Western style of government and of doing things was superior to their own, and now they are trying to push that agenda on the local populations, the other folks that were native populations. These intellectuals saw the gap, however, between Western democratic theory and Western colonial practice. As most of the nations of Europe by this point had adopted constitutional government, as we see, they did not rule their colonies in a very constitutional way. Instead, they dominated their colonies, even if it was through indirect rule. They did not give the local populations, for example, the right to vote on what kind of governing structure they wanted. Okay, Africans in particular had little chance to participate in the colonial institutions except for those elites that had been trained by the British to do the British will. And many had lost their farms for terrible jobs in sweatshops or on plantations. During the 20th century, resentment turned to action. Some educated native peoples began to organize political parties and movements to try to end foreign rule. In other words, they developed their own nationalist sentiments. So nationalism is still a major factor as we move into the 20th century. Nationalism that was actually fostered by colonial rule. Now let's talk about imperialism in India. During the 18th century, British power in India increased as the power of the Mughal rulers declined. Now, the British had been in India since the 1600s, and they had ruled in a kind of indirect way for so many years, with the Mughal rulers being, I guess you would say, incorporated by the British to rule in a way that was favorable to the British. To rule India, the British East India Company, as it was not really the British government at the time, but the British East India Company, had its own soldiers and forts that were actually buttressed by the British government, but that was still the British East India Company. It also hired some native Indians as soldiers to help them maintain control over the British East India Company interests. These Indian soldiers were called sepoys. And in 1857, some of these sepoys, these Indians, revolted against the British. This was known as the Sepoy Mutiny. They revolted against the British East India Company officials. Okay, the Sepoy Mutiny or Great Rebellion to the British. It was actually the first war of independence for the Indians. The immediate cause was that there was a rumor that the British were passing out bullet cases for the weapons that the sepoys would use to protect the British East India Company interests that were actually greased with cow and pig fat. Now, the Indian population was a mix. There were some Hindus and there were also some Muslims. And Hindus saw the cow as sacred, and pig or pork is taboo to Muslims. And it would require these Hindus and these Muslims to handle these cartridge casings, these bullet cartridge casings that were greased with things that they were not allowed, according to their religion, to touch. So this was seen as, the British not really understanding the cultural practices of the Indians or not caring to understand them. And this group of sepoys eventually saw this as the last straw. They did not like British rule anyways. They saw this as the last straw and they refused to use the bullets. The British arrested the offenders, causing the rest of the sepoys to go on a rampage and kill 50 European men, women, and children that were colonists in the region. This revolt spread quickly, and it became extremely violent throughout India, but it was crushed by the British within a year. The Indian population was vastly outnumbered, and the rivalries between the Muslims and the Hindus hurt cooperation among their forces. At Kanpur, Indians with swords and knives massacred 200 defenseless women and children, but when they recaptured Kanpur, the British took their revenge and massacred all of them. As a result of the Sepoy Mutiny, the British Parliament transferred the powers of the British East India Company, having control over India as a colony, which would be indirect rule for the British government, to taking more direct rule over India. The British government will officially take over India, not just the British East India Company as it had been since the 1600s, but the British government itself will take over direct rule over India in 1876. And Queen Victoria, who was the monarch at the time, acquired the title of Empress of India as a result. The British government ruled India directly now through a British official known as a viceroy, a governor who rules as a representative of the monarch. And if you think about it, the name makes sense. Vice meaning representative of, roy of royalty, almost like a vice king or a vice monarch, if you will. The viceroy in India was assisted by a British civil service staff of about 3,500 people who ruled the 300 million Indians living in India. British rule had both benefits and costs for India, however. One benefit was that the British brought order to a society that had been racked by civil war for many, many hundreds of years, especially between the Muslim and Hindu populations. But it also led to a fairly honest government in some cases. Lord Thomas Macaulay set up a new school system, and the goal of that new system was to train Indian children to work in the colonial administrative system and in the army, to basically, I guess you would say, assimilate the Indian population into British traditions and British society. The new system served, however, only the upper class Indian population. 90% of the country remained illiterate, and Britain also introduced infrastructure like the telegraph and railroads, but to the benefit of the British, not really of the native population. Perhaps the greatest cost to the Indians of the British rule was economic. The British manufactured goods ultimately destroyed the local industries and the local manufactured goods. In rural areas, the zamindars increased and collected taxes from the peasants, forcing many to become tenant farmers or to lose their land entirely. So the zamindars were the the officials under British control that would be their tax collectors, if you will. The British also insisted that what was being planted would be for the benefit of the British. Remember how the British were big textile producers, especially cotton textiles. We've been discussing that for a few units now. So what the British did was they persuaded many farmers in India to switch from growing food for the Indian population to growing cotton instead. Ultimately, this cotton would be harvested and would be sent back to England, and then would be manufactured into cotton textiles and then be sold back to India as well as other nations that traded with Great Britain. This would be to the benefit of Great Britain, but not to the Indians, because ultimately, because they were growing so much cotton instead of food, food supplies could not keep up with the population, and therefore, between 1800 and 1900, 30 million Indian people starved to death. This is largely because the British insisted that they grow cotton instead of food. The British made sure there was enough food for their folks, their colonists that were there, that were sent there, and for those that were working within the British system, but there was not enough food being produced for that 300 million population that lived in India. And ultimately, this shows you that, social Darwinism, that these British felt that they had the right to do this, to exploit the land, to exploit the native population for their interests rather than doing anything to benefit the native population. British rule was degrading to the educated ultimately. The upper class Indians that were educated in the British system eventually started to think that they were being, they figured out that they were being manipulated. Top jobs were reserved for the British still, the British colonists that were sent there, and the rulers believed that they were superior to the Indian population. The British also showed a lot of disrespect for Indian culture. For example, they used the Taj Mahal, which had been built hundreds of years before by an Indian ruler. They started to use it as a place for weddings and parties, almost like a banquet hall instead of a holy place as it had been built to be a holy place. They even chipped off pieces of it to take home to Great Britain as souvenirs, completely disregarding, the culture of the native population. British racial attitudes also will lead to the Indian nationalist movement that will develop even stronger as we move into the 20th century. Again, this nationalist movement will try to push for Indian independence after World War I. They will not be successful then, but after World War II is fought, they will be a lot more successful under the leadership of Mohandas Gandhi. We'll talk more about that in a later unit. Now, so we will talk about Gandhi here a little bit too, just so you know, okay? So let's talk a little bit about this Indian nationalist movement that pops up. The first Indian nationalists were the upper class, English-educated people who preferred reform over revolution. Many came from urban areas in India like Mumbai, then called Bombay, and Calcutta. The slow pace of reform convinced most Indian nationalists, however, that they had to do more. So in 1885, a small group of Indians formed the Indian National Congress, the INC. At first, it called only for a share in the governing process, not full independence. They just were arguing the British to give them more of a say in the governing, not to try to expel the British altogether. But a split between the Hindu population and the Muslim population plagued the INC for years and years and years. Muslims began to call for a separate league to better represent their interests in India for the millions of Muslims living there. Now, the Hindu population was larger than the Muslim population, but the Muslim population did not feel that if the Hindus had more people and more of a say, that the Muslim interests would be adequately represented in the INC. So they will eventually splinter off and form their own Muslim League. In 1915, the return of a young lawyer, this is in the midst of World War I, from studying abroad as well as helping to govern other British colonies where he was sent. This young lawyer gave new life to the independence movement. This is Mohandas Gandhi pictured here. He was born in Gujarat and educated in England. While working at a law firm in South Africa, where he was sent to serve after he received his education in England, serving the interests of the Indian workers there that had been sent to South Africa, Gandhi became aware of racial exploitation. Remember, in South Africa, apartheid, or this white supremacy, was actually part of the policy. Even though it really was part of the policy in most all of these colonies, it was blatantly public. And it inspired him to pursue an independence movement in India, in his own homeland, recognizing that cooperation with the British was not really in the best interest of the Indian people. This independence movement that Mohandas Gandhi wanted to start, however, was not based on violence and revolution like the Sepoy Mutiny had been. Instead, he believed the only real way to get Indian independence was to show the world that they should have it through nonviolent protest. The aim was to win aid for the poor and for the independence movement. Gandhi's movement would indeed lead to independence, but not until after World War II. But his policy of nonviolence eventually will inspire other civil rights leaders, even in the United States. Martin Luther King Jr. will adopt the same principles of nonviolence and passive resistance to try to win, civil rights for the African American population in the United States. He was very much influenced by the passive resistance nonviolence movement of Mohandas Gandhi in India a generation before him. Now, I mentioned before that there was there was a lot of British educated Indians that were, initially used by the British to help govern India, but they would eventually become more and more culturally aware of their own nation and wanting to, instead of continuing to perpetuate the British system, wanting to embrace their own cultural identity. A British college opened in Calcutta, and a local publishing house issued textbooks on subjects including Sanskrit, the original writing system of the Indian population. The work of writers such as the illustrious Indian author Rabindranath Tagore tried to promote pride in a national Indian consciousness in the face of British domination. Tagore's life work was to promote human dignity and world peace, very much influenced by Gandhi. His interest was ideas, and he set up a school that became a national university eventually. Now let's talk about nation building in Latin America. Nationalist revolts in Latin America. By the end of the 18th century, the political ideals of the revolution in North America were actually threatening European control of Latin America. The Creole elites that we discussed back with the Age of Exploration time period were especially influenced by revolutionary ideals that they saw in North America with the American Revolution, as well as in Europe with the French Revolution. They found the ideas of a free press, free trade, and equality before the law from the Enlightenment period very attractive. Now remember, these are folks who had been influenced by the Spanish for centuries by this point, the Spanish having control over most of South America for so long. They resented the colonial control of trade there as well, so they started to push for independence from Spanish control. They especially resented those peninsulares, the Spanish and Portuguese officials who resided temporarily in Latin America, who were born in Spain and Portugal, residing temporarily in Latin America for political and economic gain, then returning to the mother countries uh, with the spoils that they had taken over in those areas. In 1804, the area now called Haiti, which had been a French colony, became the first independent state in Latin America when a slave revolt led to Francois Dominique Toussaint Louverture taking over and creating Haiti as an independent state. This was, of course, during the time that France was dominated by Napoleon. Napoleon tried to put down this rebellion, but he was constantly fighting wars against the Europeans simultaneously, and he could not spread his forces out so thin. So eventually he had to give in and allow for Haiti to become a free state, no longer under French control. He saw that he had bigger fish to fry in Europe in the wars of Napoleon. In 1810, following in the footsteps of Haiti, Miguel Hildago was the first hero of the Mexican movement for independence against the Spanish. He had been inspired by the French Revolution. He urged the mestizos, those people of European and native descent in the region, to free themselves from Spanish control. They were defeated and Hildago was executed, but his memory lived on for later movements. The involvement of the natives and the mestizos in the revolt against Spain frightened both the Creoles and the Peninsulares who had been in charge, ruling in the name of the Spanish in this region for so long. They eventually cooperated in defeating the popular revolutionary forces, cooperating with the Spanish. They then, however, overthrew the Spanish in order to preserve their own power. In 1821, Mexico declared its independence from Spain. The Creole military leader, Augustin de Iturbide, named himself Emperor of Mexico in 1822, but he will be deposed. Eventually, Mexico will become a republic, and even though Hidalgo was killed earlier on, those that had supported him will now have his dream of Mexico becoming an independent republic. Two members of the Creole elite, Jose de San Martin of Argentina and Simon Bolivar of Venezuela, are both considered the liberators of South America from Spanish control. San Martin believed the Spanish had to be removed from all of South America if any South American nation was ever to be free. And he himself led a movement to free Argentina from Spanish control in 1810. In 1817, he led forces against the Spanish in Chile to try to free Chile. He crossed the Andes in an amazing march during which many soldiers died. The arrival of his army in Chile surprised the Spanish and their forces were defeated. San Martin wanted to move on to Lima, the center of Spanish authority after that. He knew he would need help of the man who had freed Venezuela from the Spanish, Simon Bolivar, to do this. And together they will be able to free most of South America from Spanish control. The one threat left was the concert of Europe that favored using troops to restore Spanish rule in Latin America. This is in the 1820s. Britain disagreed because it wished to trade with Latin America. And so ultimately, this will kind of destabilize the concert of Europe's forces that had tried to maintain European control over, or Spanish control mostly, over Latin America. The United States President, James Monroe, actually issued the Monroe Doctrine in this time period as well, which warned against European involvement in Latin America and guaranteed the independence of new Latin American nations. Now, this may sound like the United States was doing this in support of their Latin American neighbors to be free from European control because, of course, America is supposed to enshrine liberty, right? But in reality, the Monroe Doctrine was declared so the United States could have more influence over Latin America than the Europeans did. Even though we will not directly take over areas in Latin America, by not allowing the Europeans to have influence there, by, quote, guaranteeing the independence of Latin America, we actually set the stage so we could come to economically dominate Latin America. Even though if we didn't dominate them politically, we did have what we called economic imperialism in Latin America throughout the late 19th century into the early 20th century. Difficulties in nation building. The new Latin American nations faced many serious problems between 1830 and 1870. These new countries would become economically dependent on Europe at first, but then, of course, the United States, especially with the Monroe Doctrine. The new nations began as republics, but soon strong leaders known as caudillos came to power, and they ruled by force, and the landed elite supported them. They became dictators of sorts. Some of them were destructive, such as the Mexican ruler who had taken over and created Mexico as a dictatorship, thwarting the republic there. His name was Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. He misused state funds, halted reforms, and created chaos in order to put himself in a position of power. In 1835, American settlers in the Mexican state of Texas revolted against Santa Anna. And Texas will eventually gain its independence in 1836 as a result of that. It started off with a war, with a battle at the Alamo, where the Texans lost to Santa Anna's forces. But eventually the United States will come in to support the Texas settlers, and Texas will gain its independence in 1836. War between Mexico and the United States will soon follow in 1846 and continuing until 1848, the Mexican-American War. Mexico lost almost one half of its territory to the United States after losing the Mexican-American War. Santa Anna's disastrous rule was followed by a period of reform between 1855 and 1876, and it was dominated by Benito Juarez, a reformer, national hero, and child of Native American parents. The United States intervention in Latin America led to the building, ultimately, of the Panama Canal, which would be opened in 1914. The United States controlled it for most of the 20th century, until President Jimmy Carter, gave control of the Panama Canal back to the Panamese during his presidency in the late 70s. Political independence did not always translate to economic independence. This is why I say that the Americans really had a lot of economic imperialism in Latin America, even if we didn't dominate the area politically outright. Britain and other Western nations will dominate the Latin American economy as well, Britain and the United States. Latin America continued to be a source of raw materials and food for the industrial West. Finished consumer goods, especially textiles, were imported into Latin America. And the continuation of this old pattern assured that Latin America would be dependent upon Europe and the United States economically for a long, long time. A basic problem for all Latin American nations was the domination of society by the landed elite, who would be willing to cooperate with the Western nations in order to keep their positions of power. Land remained the basis of wealth, prestige, and power in Latin America throughout the 19th century. The landed elite ran the governments and made huge profits by cooperating with the Western nations at the expense of the local populations, while the masses lived in dire poverty. Corruption. After 1870, Latin American governments started to write constitutions similar to those in the United States and in Europe. Ruling elites kept their power, however, often by restricting voter rights. After the Spanish-American War, where the United States won control over Cuba, as well as Guam and the Philippines, Cuba became a United States protectorate, and Puerto Rico was annexed to the United States. In 1903, the United States supported a rebellion that allowed Panama to become an independent nation. In return, the United States received the land on which it built the Panama Canal. American investments in Latin America soon followed and continued to benefit America more than the local populations. Beginning in 1898, military forces were sent into Latin America to protect American interests there, American economic interests. The United States Marines were in Haiti from 1915 to 1934, and Nicaragua was occupied by the United States from 1909 to 1933, all to protect American economic interests. So even though we did not outrightly control those areas, we really did economically control those areas, and we would prop up rulers in those areas that would ultimately cooperate with us to maintain our economic interests in the region. Resentment built against the big power from the north ultimately, and this will cause friction as we move deeper into the 20th century. In Mexico, among other Latin American countries, large landowners supported the dictators who looked out for the interests of the ruling elite, which also cooperated with the West. The dictator Porfirio Diaz ruled Mexico between 1877 and 1911 with the support of the army, the Catholic Church, the aristocrats, and foreign capitalists. That means the U.S. We helped prop up this dictator because it benefited our economic interests in the region. A liberal landowner forced Diaz out eventually, and a wider revolution started. This was begun by Emiliano Zapata, who demanded agrarian reform. You see him pictured below. He aroused the peasants to revolt against the wealthy. And between 1910 and 1920, the Mexican Revolution raged. Ultimately, a new constitution would be enacted in 1917 to set up a government led by a president, created land reform, established limits on foreign investment, and set out to help the workers. And during this time, the United States lost some of their economic interest in the region. After 1900, Latin America had a period of economic prosperity. As you see, really started after 1870, if you look up at the top, due to the exportation of a few major items, including wheat and beef from Argentina, coffee from Brazil, and bananas from Central America. After 1900, Latin America began doing more of its own manufacturing. Due to the prosperity, the middle sectors, of the Latin American society, which is the middle class, grew, even though they were too small to make up a genuine middle class like we see in most other Western nations. The middle sectors were only 5 to 10% of the population in Latin America, as opposed to the majority, or at least 50% in most Western nations. Members of Latin American middle class had shared characteristics. They lived in cities, they sought education and decent incomes, and they saw the United States as a model, especially for industrialization. So they wanted to become more like the West rather than rejecting the West. But they wanted independence when it came to governing themselves. They sought reform, not revolution, and usually voted with the landed elites to ultimately try to control their own destinies. Now, let's talk a little bit about imperialism in China. This goes along with the next chapter, chapter 22, section 1. Foreign influence in China equals loss of sovereignty for China. The causes of decline was because of the foreign influence. Now, the Qing dynasty had ruled in China for quite some time, and they had attempted to restrict British trade in the region in the 18th century. They wanted to reduce the amount of British influence by only allowing the British to trade in certain parts of China. Certain ports were open to British trade, but they were only allowed to trade in these certain ports, and they were only allowed to purchase Chinese goods using silver bullion. They tried to do this to try to reduce the influence of British in China because they did not want the British to try to completely exploit the region as they had done in India. Now, since 1759, European commercial presence was limited by the Qing, like I said. They wanted to control what came in and what went out. Foreign merchants, like I said, were forced to deal solely with licensed Chinese traders, Chinese firms, and the currency of the trade was silver bullion only, which was expensive for the British. The British wanted to bring their British goods in and trade them with the Chinese, rather than having to pay silver bullion for the Chinese goods that they wanted. But the rules were that the Chinese did not, quote, want the British goods. Instead, they just wanted the silver bullion. The British East India Company had a kind of idea to try to circumvent this. The British East India Company at this point in time was still in charge of India. So even though they worked hand in hand with the British government, they were still in charge of India. And of course, they were heavily involved in the opium trade. Opium could be grown in India, which was a British colony. And so what they decided to do was and opium, as we know, is a highly addictive painkiller, highly addictive drug. And so the British government through the British East India Company, started to smuggle opium into China, hoping to get the Chinese hooked on this drug, okay? They smuggled it in through the black market, and it took off like gangbusters. Opium grown in India would be sold in China on the black market in exchange for the Chinese giving silver to the British for the opium. Now, of course, this was a legal trade. It was a drug trade, drug trafficking, if you will. The British government was involved in drug trafficking, is what this is. And of course, the silver that the Chinese paid on the black market for the opium that they got hooked on and wanted to buy more and more of, that silver was then used by the British to buy other Chinese products that they wanted in the officially licensed areas they were allowed to trade. So in other words, the British were not spending British silver on these Chinese products. They were actually getting the silver from the Chinese and then giving it back to the Chinese in exchange. They were getting the silver from the Chinese in exchange for the opium that they were selling them. And then they were using that silver to buy the other silks and other products that they wanted from tea that they wanted from China, ultimately costing the British very little and economically costing the Chinese way, way more. Okay, so basically they got the Chinese hooked on drugs, and then they used the silver the Chinese paid for the opium to buy the Chinese goods. It's evil, but it's also brilliant at the same time. Increasing trade and social ills were evident throughout China by the late 1830s. The opium that was being smuggled in was causing a crisis, a real crisis, social crisis in China. So many people were hooked on this drug, this highly addictive drug. Many were dying in overdoses, and it was causing real problems in Chinese society by the late 1830s. The Chinese government, the Qing government, moved to enforce a true ban on the opium trade because it was illegal. And British agents decided that they would engage in military retaliation to support the British, quote, right to trade opium in China. And this resulted in what's known as the Opium Wars. Yes, folks, the British government will send military forces into China to force them to accept an illegal drug trade, the Opium Wars. So the British Navy moves in and they demolish the Chinese in the Opium Wars, and they sailed up the Changyang River almost unopposed. The Chinese were forced into a series of disadvantageous treaties as a result of their loss in the Opium Wars. Hong Kong the city of Hong Kong, would be ceded to the British in the Treaty of Nanjing of 1842. This meant that Hong Kong would be a British colony, and Hong Kong would remain a possession of Great Britain until 1997, folks. 1997. Other ports were also be open to British traders, not just this few small ports that had been allowed by the Qing leadership before. And later on, other countries will force their way into China through similar treaties, and these all became known as the unequal treaties because these treaties primarily benefited the Western countries rather than the Chinese. The British traders were also, with the Treaty of Nanjing and other unequal treaties, they were granted what was called extraterritoriality, where they were not subject to Chinese laws at all, but rather British laws instead. It's kind of like a diplomatic immunity. In other words, they could trade opium as much as they wanted to the Chinese because it was not against British law for them to trade to the Chinese, even though it was against the Chinese law. Extraterritoriality that they forced the Chinese to accept with their loss in the Opium Wars meant that the British basically could do whatever they wanted. So even though the Chinese government still was under the Qing dynasty, they were inoculated. They were completely being manipulated by these European nations, starting with Great Britain and then others moving in. And that's why this political cartoon you see on the far right kind of explains it all. You have the representative of the Chinese in the back going, stop! And you have them, what looks as representations of all the different European nations as well as Japan there, all carving up China like one big pie. Okay, you see, what looks like Queen Victoria, you see what looks like Kaiser William the First. Then you have somebody representing what looks like Austria, and then Marianne, the French symbol of nationalism with the red bonnet on. Then, of course, the one that looks like a Japanese soldier, all carving up their own interests in China, economic interests in China. This will lead to internal problems within China for the Qing dynasty. The Taiping Rebellion happens between 1850 and 1864, which ultimately, the population had been rising there for 100 years through 1800 and 1900, and there was not enough food. That was just another problem in addition to the opium addiction. The Taiping Rebellion happened in 1850 and will continue on and off for 14 years. It's the largest of these rebellions. It ultimately will fail, but it will lead to the self-strengthening movement as a response to the Taiping defeat. Excuse me. The self-strengthening movement was a blend of Chinese cultural traditions with European industrial technology. These folks believed that the only way that they could strengthen China was to adopt some Western principles, to change the Chinese economy and society to more Western ways. The self-strengthening movement, however, will not have widespread changes being able to be enacted. It was superficial only, but it was, for the most part, China will still remain, not embracing of Western industrialization, and they will continue to be dominated economically by the West because they did not embrace Western modernization. The Qing dynasty loses tributary states to the Europeans and to the Japanese. Japan demanded territory and bullied their way into China, just like the European nations did. And China itself would be divided into spheres of influence by 1895, meaning that all those areas were dominated ultimately by European or other foreign powers economically. And really, even though they didn't have political boots on the ground, because they had their armies there, they were able to really dominate the region. In other words, the Chinese authorities were puppet governors only. This will lead to more internal strife, of course. The 100-Day Reforms in 1898 was a new interpretation of Confucianism to bring change. failing to westernize China, okay, ultimately led to the Boxer Rebellion of 1899. Okay, now the Boxer Rebellion was an attempt to fight to rid China of the foreign influences. It will not be successful. It was led by a member of the royal family, the Empress Dowager Gigi, and she lived from 1835 to 1908. This happens in 1899. And it was called the Boxer Rebellion because the Boxers, it was known as the Society of Harmonious Fists. So the Westerners referred to them as Boxers because harmonious fists, get it? Anyhow, these Chinese nationalists that are trying to oust the foreign devils besieged the European embassies that were all over China in 1900 to try to force the foreigners out. The European nations that had spheres of influence in China responded by sending armies in to crush the Boxer Rebellion. So it's a coalition of European forces were sent into China, and China was forced once again to accept the stationing of foreign troops in their territories. Once again, unequal treaties, and once again, the foreign nations will have a lot of dominance in China. Chinese decline after the Boxer Rebellion will eventually lead to, during World War I and World War II, a new nationalist movement in China. But these nationalists will be, first there will be a Republican. They've tried to create a republic. But eventually, after World War II, we see the more communist movement taking over the nationalist movement in China, and they will be the ones successful at declaring Chinese independence in 1949 under a communist government under Chairman Mao. We'll get to all of that in a later unit. Now let's talk a little bit about the rise of modern Japan, because this is a little different approach than we saw happen in China. Europeans, Americans, all attempt to establish relations with Japan by the middle of the 19th century. Before that, Japan had only allowed the Dutch to have any kind of trade presence, and that was in one place, Nagasaki, Japan. But in 1853, a United States naval officer named Matthew Perry sailed a gunship up into Edo Bay, Tokyo, okay, and forced the Japanese to open the port and give concessions, economic concessions, to the United States. This sparked conservative Japanese reaction against the shogun, who really was in charge of Japan in the name of the emperor, to rally around the emperor to actually have maybe some real power now instead of the shogun controlling him in Kyoto. This will actually lead to the Meiji Restoration of imperial control. This will lead to this brief civil war, 1868, between the imperial forces and the Tokugawa forces, the shogun's forces. In 1868, the imperial forces win, and Emperor Mushito, also nicknamed Meiji, that's why it's called the Meiji Restoration, takes power. The goals of the Meiji Restoration were prosperity and strength, rich country, strong army. And so under Meiji's guidance, he was a younger man, and he believed that if Japan did not mimic the West when it came to modernization, they too would suffer the same fate that China had suffered. Already the United States had forced ports open. If they did not want to end up like China, where they were completely dominated by foreign influences, because they could not compete militarily against the foreign influences, then they had to become more like the West in order to compete with the West. So the goals of prosperity and strength, like I said before, caused Japan to finally resolve to learn Western technology, and by doing so, they can compete with the West. They will industrialize very quickly. Within a generation, Japan will be completely industrialized, and they too will become imperialistic by the early 20th century. This is one of the reasons why they will challenge Russian dominance of Asiatic territories in 1905 in the Russo-Japanese War and ultimately defeat Russia in that war. So the rise of modern Japan begins with the Meiji Restoration in 1868, and we'll see the implications of that in particular in the second half of the 20th century, especially during World War II.